Hello, this is the pre-lecture video for Chapter 3, Part 2. Today we'll be talking about formulas from combustion data, reaction stoichiometry, limiting and excess reactants, and yields. Let's talk about a combustion analysis problem. This problem here is routinely used to analyze compounds that contain C, H, and O. And we'll even see later on that this third atom can actually vary and be almost any third atom at all. The way this technique works is we start with a sample that contains up to these three elements. So we have a compound that contains C, we have a compound that contains H, and then the compound also contains, in this example, this third atom of oxygen. So the way this technique works is all of the carbon in our sample is converted into CO2. All of the hydrogen in our sample is converted into water. And then very precisely, we determine the mass of these products. So what you can do from the mass of CO2 that's produced, or from the mass of water that's produced, is very carefully figure out how many grams of carbon are in the original sample and how many grams of hydrogen are in the original sample. So as long as you start with your sample here, and you know its mass, then you can understand that really what we're determining in one way might be like the percent carbon in the sample. If we compare how many grams of carbon there are in the sample, and we know the mass of the sample, we can just take the number of grams of carbon, divide by the sample mass, times 100%. That would be our percent carbon. And the same thing for hydrogen, the same thing for that third element by difference. That's why any third element can be analyzed here, is because we're going to determine this third element by simple difference. Oxygen is routinely used, but we'll also see some other types of elements used as well. Let's work through a problem and actually see we actually don't necessarily need to convert the data into percent by mass values, though we could if we wanted to. There's a variety of ways we can solve these problems, but the key is just trying to think through very clearly that we're just starting with a compound that contains three elements. One of them is carbon. We very precisely determine the mass of CO2 produced. All the carbon goes to CO2, so we can determine from the mass of CO2 the mass of carbon. All the hydrogen in the sample is converted to water. From the mass of water produced, we can very carefully figure out how much of that's hydrogen, therefore how much of the sample originally contained hydrogen, then that third element by difference. Let's look at an example. So here's an example. We're told here hexanoic acid, which interestingly turns out to be responsible for the odor in dirty socks, is composed of CH and O. Combustion of a 0.225 gram sample of the compound produces 0.512 grams of CO2 and 0.209 grams of water. What is the empirical formula of the compound? So just like our percent by mass problems, the best we're going to do with this data alone will be the simplest ratio of the elements. That is the empirical formula. Okay, so to get started here, just the whole idea is that all of the carbon in the sample, all of this carbon is produced into this CO2. So the question is, how many grams of carbon are there in the 0.512 grams of CO2? Well, that's pretty easy. That's just taking the molar mass. We can take the molar mass of CO2. It's 44.01 grams per mole of CO2. 1 mole of CO2 is comprised of 1 mole of carbon. And then 1 mole of carbon has a mass of 12.01 grams in the periodic table. So we're just basically saying, of the 0.512 grams of CO2, how many grams are due to the carbon atoms in the sample? And it should be probably, somewhat less than 0.512, definitely not more, but not particularly small. So we're probably going to be looking at 0.1 or 0.2 grams. So we work this out. This ends up working out to be 0.1397 grams of carbon. Now that's good right off the bat because our sample is 0.225 grams. So approximately 0.140 grams of that will be due to the carbon within the sample. Okay, if we're tracking sig figs, and we all love sig figs, we got 3 sig figs in this value. And I'm tracking an extra one on as we go through the problem. Okay, now let's switch colors. So let's go back to whatever it was, I think. Blue was the hydrogen on the previous slide. So our hydrogen is being converted into water. So how much of that water mass is due simply to the hydrogen atoms? Now, one thing you could confuse yourself off the bat is, well, both of these compounds contain oxygen. Our sample contains oxygen. Well, some of the oxygen from our sample goes into CO2's mass and into water's mass, but we're really having the compound combust with excess oxygen to go into the CO2 and into the water. So if we imagine this reaction taking place, we have a lot of external oxygen that's adding into the mass of CO2 and the mass of water. So the oxygen mass really has nothing to do with the mass of water or CO2 produced, but the hydrogen does. All the hydrogen goes to the mass of water. Okay, so we start with the 0.209 grams of water. And then from there, we're going to use the molar mass of water. So it's 18.02 grams per mole of water. Now, one difference here is 1 mole of water contains 2 moles of H atoms. And 1 mole of hydrogen has the average mass in the periodic table, 1.008 grams. Now, one thing you can confuse yourself about on this problem is, well, when do I use hydrogen versus H2? Like H2 gas. Well, this has really nothing to do with H2 gas in this problem. We're just trying to say, of the 0.209 grams of water, how much of that mass is due to the H atoms? The remaining mass is due to the O atoms. So we're just trying to break down our compound and say, okay, it's 18.02 grams for the entire mole of the compound, but 1 mole of the compound contains 2 moles of H, then 1 mole of H, average atomic weight from the periodic table. This works out to be 0.02338 grams of hydrogen, the 3 sig figs as well. Okay, now, we're not exactly getting close to solving our problem. We're getting closer, but we still need to do a couple of steps. The mass of oxygen, let's change colors. So the grams of oxygen, we're going to go by difference. So we figure out how much of our sample is carbon, 0.140 grams approximately grams of carbon, 0.0234 grams are hydrogen, the rest is oxygen. So the oxygen grams, we're going to take the total sample mass, 0.225 grams, and then subtract the mass of carbon. I'll just write this as grams of carbon minus grams of hydrogen. I can plug these values in and then obtain the mass of oxygen. That ends up working out to be 0.0619 grams of oxygen. Okay, so I actually need a little bit more room to continue this problem. So I'm going to go to another slide and then come back to the second problem here in a minute. So I'm going to go to another slide and then start with the masses of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and kind of carry on from there. Okay, so we have just rewritten the numbers here for carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and just kind of reminding ourselves that this entire 0.225 gram sample, we've now worked out the composition by the 3 specific elements making it up. Now, at this point, we could divide each of those values by the sample mass, convert into a percent by mass, and then solve this problem like the percent by mass problems we saw in the previous lecture. Well, that adds an extra step. There's really no need to necessarily go that way to solve the problem, but of course you could. So if that's how you are comfortable solving this problem, give it a try. All we really need to do is recognize we have the masses of the elements in terms of their ratios. Like this is a ratio of the masses in the compounds. The empirical formula is going to be the ratio of the moles, and the simplest ratio of the moles. So all we need to do is convert grams to moles using our average atomic weights. So we're going to use 12.01 grams per mole of carbon. We're going to use 1.008 grams per mole of hydrogen. And we're going to use 16.00 grams per mole of oxygen. Okay, we work this out, and we get 0.01163 moles of carbon. We get 0.02319 moles of hydrogen. And then finally we get 0.00386 moles of oxygen. Okay, so the general step next is divide by the smallest. You won't always get whole numbers, but if we don't get a whole number, then we need to start multiplying these all by a whole number until all three of them are whole numbers. But we're going to see that this works out pretty easily. So we're going to set this to x, that's our smallest. So we're going to divide these all by the same value to keep our ratio intact. And so then our moles of carbon works out to be 3. The moles of hydrogen works out very nicely to be 6. And then, of course, the same number by itself is 1. So our ratio, our formula, comes out to be equal to C3H6O. Okay, so that's the empirical formula. It could be the molecular formula too, we don't know, without doing a second experiment. So this would be the simplest ratio, the empirical formula. Okay, so what we would need to do is figure out, are there 1, 2, 3, etc. empirical units in one molecule? So we can do that experiment, and that's the second part of our question from the previous slide. So we see that we got the empirical formula, C3H6O. From a mass spectrometry experiment, the molar mass of hexanoic acid was determined to be 116 grams per mole. We don't need to know exactly how that experiment's conducted. It's just a type of experiment that can be used to determine very easily the molar mass of a compound. So what is the molecular formula of this compound? Well, what we'd want to begin with is, well, what's the empirical weight of the compound? If we take the 3 carbons plus the 6 hydrogens plus the O, that comes up with a mass of 8.08 AMU, and then the molecular weight was 116. So to determine our molecular formula, like our multiplier, we would take our molecular weight, divide by the empirical formula weight. And we should get a whole number, so 116 grams per mole, divide by 58.08 grams per mole, gives us a factor of 2. So there's 2 of the empirical units in the formula. And so that would give us a formula of C, 3 times 2 of 6, 6 times 2 of 12, and O, 1 times 2 for 2. So C6H12O2. Now, in terms of the structure, in case you're curious, it looks like hexane, where we have CH3, CH2, CH2, CH2. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it goes COOH. So actually it looks like acetic acid. Acetic acid is this with a CH3 COOH. So this is like acetic acid with a longer tail. Interestingly, we eat and consume, or can consume, acetic acid. Probably don't want to consume too much of this hexanoic acid, since it's, the odor of dirty socks. Okay, so that's how we can take experimental data in terms of a combustion experiment and its data and turn that into an empirical formula, and then with the second experiment, use that data to determine the molecular formula for the compound. So that takes us through section 3.5. Moving into section 3.6, we start to get into a major set of topics, that being stoichiometry. And this is how we get quantitative information from reactions. So we can start here with a simple idea or simple picture that we have H2 plus O2 leading to 2 waters. So the whole idea here is that our reaction is just giving us the before and then the after. So we have this present before, and then this is what we have after the reaction. And so what we could do is have 4 grams of hydrogen, that's the mass of 2 moles, react with 1 mole of oxygen, that's 32 grams, to then form the mass of 36.0 grams of water. Okay, so the coefficients are showing us that for every 2 moles of hydrogen that react, they have to react with 1 O2. So 2 molecules to 1 molecule of O2 on the molecular level gives us 2 molecules of water. On the mole level, you could say, well, 2 moles of H2 require a mole of O2 to form 2 moles of water. So we can sort of try to picture this as what goes on in the reaction. And then the reality is we're going to run the reaction on much larger scales. Now, the one thing that's sometimes confusing at first is you may look at this reaction and say, okay, if we're going to mix together hydrogen and oxygen, that we have to mix together precisely 2 moles of hydrogen and 1 mole of oxygen. Can we mix together some other ratio? The answer is yes. You can mix together whatever ratio of reactants you wish. The key is you may not get you may have one of those reactants left over after the reaction. You can run this reaction with 2 moles of hydrogen, 2 moles of oxygen, still form water, and then just have some of that oxygen left over after the reaction. Likewise, we can run this reaction maybe the other way around, where we have not enough hydrogen for the reaction to take place, or not enough oxygen for the reaction to take place, so then there's hydrogen left over after the reaction. Okay, so our reactions are just telling us when the reaction occurs, what's the ratio of the reactants that have to react together to give us the ratio of the products that are formed. We can mix together whatever ratios we want to mix together, and then some things may be left over afterwards, and we can quantify that using some of the techniques we'll see here in the next 2 sections. So let's take a look at a sort of basic stoichiometry problem, hopefully something you've seen before and recall problems that look like this. So how many grams of water can be produced from the complete combustion of 1.00 grams of glucose? Okay, so when we approach this problem, the way we might begin it is to kind of recognize that for every 1 mole of glucose that reacts, we're going to form 6 moles of water, okay, from this balanced reaction. Now, the reaction is balanced. If it wasn't balanced, we have to go determine these coefficients, which is relatively easy enough, but that's already done for us within this particular example. Okay, I like dimensional analysis because it gives us a clear starting point. We're going to start with the number of grams of water. That's what we're looking for. And we're going to begin with the number that we're given in terms of glucose, 1.00 grams of glucose. Now, this is just generally how you might approach a problem. Start with what you're looking for. In terms of a value in your dimensional analysis step, start with some quantity that you're given and see if we can solve the problem. Okay, if we're going to convert 1 mole to 6 moles, we got to go from grams to moles of our reactant. So we need to use the molar mass of glucose. That's about 180.2 grams per mole of C6H12O6. Okay, then from there, we convert for every 1 mole of glucose, we're going to form 6 moles of water in the reaction. And for every 1 mole of water, that's 18.02 grams. So when we work this out, the grams of water works out to, on the calculator, to be 0.6 grams, and that should have 3 significant figures. So 0.600 grams of water form by the combustion of 1 gram of glucose. I mentioned earlier that you can mix together whichever ratio of reactants that you want to mix together in a reaction. And so it could be the case that we have what's called a limiting versus an excess reactant. The limiting reactant is going to be the reactant present in the smallest stoichiometric amount. It's going to limit the amount of product that can form. The excess reactant is the one that will remain once the limiting reactant has been completely consumed, and then the maximum amount of product at that point will have formed. Okay, so in this example, we're starting with a picture here, so we can try to picture on the molecule level 10 molecules of hydrogen and 7 molecules of oxygen reacting together. Now, what we're forming are water molecules, so we're simply undergoing this reaction of 2H2 plus O2 goes to 2H2O. Okay, so if I can lasso out 2 hydrogens, the hydrogens are the gray shaded atoms. If I can ratio out an oxygen, then what happens is we form 1 water molecule and we form another water molecule. So that gives us 2 waters. So we can do this again. So we do this again, lasso out 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. We get 2 more water molecules. Sort of split the oxygen, split the hydrogen, form water. We can do it again. So let's do it again over here. Let's take these two hydrogens here and get 1 water, 2 waters. Okay, so I'm up to 6 waters if you're counting being formed. And then lastly, I think I can do this 2 more times. So I can lasso out these 2 here, and then I'll lasso out these 2 here. Okay, and so then I get a total of 10 waters that form altogether. But notice how I ran out of hydrogens at this point. My hydrogen's been completely consumed, turned into the product, and then we're left with these 2 oxygen molecules. Now, it's a gas mixture, so they're flying around. They're all bumping into each other. So here's our water, or our oxygens that are remaining. That's our excess reactant. So O2 is the excess reactant. Hydrogen's been consumed. It's all gone. I don't see any hydrogens left over. It's all been converted into the products. I have 10 waters that have formed. No hydrogens left over. So H2 is the limiting reactant. Sometimes I call it the LR. And then oxygen is the ER, the excess reactant. Another topic discussed is the theoretical yield. The theoretical yield is the maximum amount of product that can be made. It's the amount of product possible as calculated through the stoichiometry problem using all of the limiting reactant. It's not going to be the amount we could calculate using the excess reactant because we would have ran out of the other reactant at that point, and we can't consume all of the excess reactant. This is different from what we actually see in the lab routinely is what we call the actual yield. The actual yield is what we actually get in the reaction. We'll see that there's experimental errors inside reactions that can limit the actual yield of a reaction. By definition, the yield should never be greater than 100%. There could be experimental errors. You could have a product that's a solid that you pick up some extra mass in the product, maybe because you have water on it that hasn't evaporated off. So there are some experimental errors that could lead it to the appearance of a yield greater than 100%. But by definition, a yield can never go greater than 100% because we can never violate the law of conservation of mass. So we can never end up with more mass than what our masses of our reactants dictate. Another idea presented in this chapter is the idea of percent yield. So if you take your actual yield, divide it by the theoretical yield, then you get the percent yield. I don't know where the percent sign. So you multiply this by 100%. I like to think of this theoretical yield as the maximum yield. So the theoretical, sometimes I call it the maximum yield. So theoretically, what's the most you should get, or what's the maximum yield you can get from a reaction? Take your actual yield, that gets you your percent yield. Okay, so we can finish up with an example to walk through limiting versus excess reactants and to walk through calculating yields. So we see in this example here, we have 2.50 grams of hydrogen, 25 grams of oxygen, fully react together to form water. So our balanced reaction is 2H2 plus O2 goes to 2H2O. So which reactant is the limiting reactant? Okay, we have a variety of ways we can approach this problem. The way I'm going to approach it is to kind of like ask a thought question. If we were to consume all of one of the reactants, how much of the second reactant will we need to react with it? Because for every 2 moles of hydrogen that react, I need 1 mole of oxygen to react along with it. So if I'm going to consume all of the hydrogen, what I might try to do is say, how many grams of oxygen do I need to react with all of the hydrogen? Now, if I get lucky, I can do this once and see, maybe even be able to answer another question afterwards. But I may have started with the excess reactant. I might have to do this problem a second time. So 2.50 grams of H2, take the molar mass of that. So that's 1.008 times 2. So that's 2.016 grams of H2 per mole of H2. So we're talking about H2. That's why we do the mass in grams for H2. Okay, so that cancels out our grams. Next step, for every 2 moles of hydrogen that react, we need 1 mole of oxygen to react with it. 1 mole of oxygen contains 2 O's, so that's 32.00 grams. Okay, so if we stop and calculate here, take 2.5, divide by 2.016, divide by 2, times 32. Let's see what we get. We get 19.84 grams of oxygen are going to react with 2.50 grams of hydrogen. So in order to make 2.50 grams of hydrogen go to 0 grams of hydrogen, we need to have 19.84 grams of oxygen to react with it and to be completely consumed in this reaction, as that H2 and that O2 are then going to lead to the formation of the water molecules in the reaction. I have 25 grams of oxygen present, so that's a good thing. If I try to consume the remaining grams of oxygen, so the oxygen difference between 25 grams and 19.84 grams is the remaining, that's the excess quantity of oxygen. So our next question says, how much of the excess reactant remains following the reaction? Hydrogen's been completely consumed, that's our limiting reactant, and then oxygen's going to be left over. We can see that there's about 5 or so grams of oxygen that are left over. Since we can calculate that excess, oxygen is our excess reactant. So the number of grams of O2 that remain in excess can be calculated by taking the 25 grams initially present and then subtracting the 19.84 grams that must be consumed to make water. Okay, so that's going to give us a quantity, once we account for sig figs, of 5.2 grams of oxygen remains. Okay, so 19.8 grams react, 5.2 grams remains. Okay, the next question then says, well, if only 21.25 grams of water forms, what's the percent yield of the reaction? Okay, let's just remind ourselves, percent yield is the actual yield divided by that theoretical maximum yield times 100%. Okay, so the 21.25, that's our actual yield. So the key is, well, what is the maximum yield? So our max yield, our theoretical yield, we calculate using the limiting reactant. So we can take our limiting reactant, 2.016 grams per mole. Then we use the 2 moles of H2. When they react, we form 2 moles of water. And then finally, 1 mole of water has a mass of 18.02 grams. Okay, so if we stop and calculate our maximum yield, 2.5, divide by 2.016, times 2 divide by 2 times 18.02 gives us a theoretical maximum yield of 22.35, good to 3 sig figs, grams of water. Okay, so we get 21.25 actually, and we should have gotten 22.35 grams times 100%. So that's a pretty high yield. So that's 95.1%. So 95.1 is our yield. Okay, like I said earlier, there's a variety of ways you can walk through these problems. You don't have to set them up the same way every time. You don't have to always follow the same thought process. You can take a couple extra steps. If you run into a problem, you can try a second technique or a second way to solve the problem. I even want to go back for a second and think about how this problem may have been a little bit different if we had started here at the beginning. What if I had done it here with 25 grams of oxygen? What would have happened? Well, what would have happened is I would have gotten the grams of hydrogen to be more than what we had given in the problem. And then I'd have to simply go back, cross that work out, and say, okay, well, that's not going to work. and then start with the other reactant, and start with the hydrogen, and then see how much the oxygen is going to react. An alternate approach to determine the limiting reactant is to look at the yield of the reaction. So an alternate approach, most people remember this from high school. If you want to determine the limiting reactant, take how much product you get from either one of the reactants, and then compare which one gives you less. That works perfectly fine too. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's a perfectly reasonable way to solve the problem. It's not the only way to solve the problem though. There's a variety of ways to solve problems, but the key is as long as you're thinking through the steps, then and understanding them, any one of these ways will make sense. You can apply them as needed and very easily solve problems with these techniques. The method of just making a set of steps that you try to memorize, that's probably not going to get you very far. We don't need to memorize the steps here. We just need to understand and comprehend. All we're doing is saying we're using the idea of the reaction. Mole-to-mole quantities or molecule-to-molecule quantities can be used as ratios so that we can mix together whatever quantities of reactants that we see in a problem and then figure out how much product is formed, how much of the excess reactant is consumed, and then how much of it remains. Okay, that's our pre-lecture video for the second half of Chapter 3. See you guys in class.